Hi everyone and welcome to AWS Nordics Office Hours with me, Gunnar Grosch. I am a developer advocate here at AWS, and I'm fortunate enough to be able to be with you every week here to hopefully inspire you how to build with AWS. And this is our weekly show where I bring on guests to talk about a specific topic, and you, our viewers, you're able to learn something new, hopefully, and get all of your questions answered. And this week, I am joined by Florin. He's a senior solutions architect at AWS. And this week, we're going to look at how to prepare and protect your applications from disruptions using a new service, AWS Resilience Hub. So welcome to the show, Florin.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So tell people a bit about yourself, what you're doing.
Sure. So I'm a senior solutions architect with AWS. This pretty much means I'm essentially owning the technical relationship with our customers. I'm assigned to different accounts, right? So I work with some of our customers. I'm specifically in the digital native space. So that's essentially companies born in the cloud that are on their way to grow. And I'm pretty much invested in continuous resilience. I'm running some programs with my customers, and as such, Resilience Hub, the new service, right, is a very interesting thing for me to share with you. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and that's how you and I've gotten to know each other as well in this time for me at AWS with resilience and with chaos engineering. So,
Sure.
Well, let's start off with AWS Resilience Hub. It was released, is it a couple of weeks ago now? And tell us a bit about what AWS Resilience Hub is.
Right. So AWS Resilience Hub is essentially a central place where you can import applications or resources connected to applications, right? And you can define what is essentially an application or workload for you, right? And you can track the resilience of these applications on AWS. So essentially, you can, on the one hand side, look at what you have, what is part of an application, and kind of create that segmentation, and create expectations in terms of resiliency, right? So like what are recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives for your application. Define these as policies, create these policies, associate them to the applications, and pretty much run assessments, right? So doing kind of a continuous resilience, pretty much like you do any kind of other testing. You wouldn't kind of launch a new feature into production before testing it and making sure there's no bug there. It's pretty much the same kind of thing with resilience. It also provides suggestions to improve your infrastructure layer, software layer, right? Standard operating procedures, fault injection experiments. So it also integrates very nicely with an earlier service released this last year, right? Fault injection simulator, in the sense that you can create disruptions, artificially create disruptions, right, in your infrastructure to measure really how resilient your application is. That's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Yeah, so we can pretty much end this session now. You've covered it all in one answer. Now we're going to dive deep on the service, and you're going to show us a couple of demos of how to use it. So a word you used several times there is resilience. So tell us about what resilience is when we're talking about, well, basically building systems.
Right. So first of all, resilience is, right, one of the core pillars of the well-architected framework. So that's essentially an aggregate of best practices and suggestions, right, that we see out there in the field with different customers. And it's essentially the capability of your application to maintain availability, to be up and serving, right, the correct kind of data information that it needs to in face of turbulent conditions, unexpected failure, right? And especially since we're looking at distributed systems, right, I guess we can all agree that building distributed systems is inherently hard, right? Like things fail all the time, and this is something that we need to embrace, right, and live with this chaos. And testing resilience, right, is essentially a way to take, your understanding of how well can the app perform from an anecdotal kind of evidence to an actual test, right, that you can run, I don't know, before big events, right, or something like that. And additionally, of course, investing in resilience, like, kind of tech debt or testing may not be the most interesting or the nicest thing to do, but it's something critical, right? So resilience by itself doesn't guarantee that the apps are going to delight customers, but I think the absence of resilience can really deter them away, right?
Right. And you mentioned AWS well-architected framework and the pillar where this falls under, the reliability pillar. And AWS Resilience Hub, it's built around some of the best practices, or it uses parts of what's in the well-architected framework. And we'll see that when you're doing the demo as well, I believe. So let me bring up your screen share, Florin, so you can walk us through a bit about what AWS Resilience Hub is.
Sure. So first of all, just to take a quick look at the service page, right? This is essentially the kind of landing page for more information. So you can get a kind of a snapshot what the service is about, what it integrates with, right? So we have here fault injection simulator, CloudFormation, systems manager, and CloudWatch, what it offers, right? There's also the links to the pricing page, and essentially this is what I would recommend. You kind of have as a first thing in mind, where when you want to learn about a new service. There's always the service page. There are blog posts, and ultimately there's the documentation, right, to deep dive into it. So that's kind of the use cases, right? As described also earlier, we are trying to really think about continuous resilience, right? See what kind of weaknesses are in the applications and protect these applications within policies that really are tailored to them, right? So again, resilience is a spectrum, right? Not every application needs to be mission critical, right, or have mission critical resilience. But we want to kind of create that separation. And of course, for these customers, for example, in financial services, right, help them meet contractual or regulatory requirements in terms of resilience, and to kind of have an overview and a dashboard that we're going to see later. So that's kind of the intro to Resilience Hub. All of these links will be shared, I think, at the end, right? So that there's no need to kind of...
Yeah, I'll post links in the chat throughout the session there.
Yeah.
So when we talk about distributed systems and perhaps the complexity there, I think it's pretty important to mention that it doesn't have to be these services that has hundreds or thousands of microservices in use. A distributed system or even a complex system can be quite small, given the way that we build systems today.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And that also goes to say that, reliability is not really just for these advanced use cases or for very, very mature workloads. That's why we actually refer to it as continuous resilience and continuous reliability, right? It's really something that can start even before the application is in production, right? If you think of operational readiness reviews of these kind of checklists, it's really about the question of what do you include in the definition of done to measure whether an application is ready to serve customers. And if it is an application that does have reliability and resilience as core a principle, like maybe it's an ordering system, maybe it's a payment system, maybe it's the kind of backend for a real-time video game or something like that, resilience is really critical there. So the journey to resilience starts maybe even before going live.
Yeah, and it's not only about the technical details as well.
Sure.
Resilience is also a cultural thing, an organizational thing, about your processes, the way that you build and operate your system as well. And I believe AWS Resilience Hub covers parts of that as well, which we'll probably see later on.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we'll dive deeper into them later, but it's a really good point, right? So when we're looking at resilience, it's not an isolated, technological thing that can be solved. If things would be so easy, I guess we would have solved it a long time ago, right? It's also about practices, people, right? Organizations, different cultures within different organizations, and that's something that Resilience Hub really touches upon. So we're going to look at infrastructure layer recommendations. We're going to look at standard operational practices, things like alarms, right, and monitoring, and experiments, right, fault injection experiments. So,
all right,
I think we can, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you just joined us, this is the AWS Nordics Office Hours with me, Gunnar. I'm joined by Florin today, and we're having a look at AWS Resilience Hub, new service that was launched a week or two ago, and with the aim then to help us prepare and protect our applications from these disruptions that we see happen in our distributed systems. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer those. So, Florin, let's get to it.
Yeah, Cool. So before we dive into Resilience Hub, let's take a quick look at what we're going to use for today's session, right, as a backdrop. So the well-architected labs are essentially a collection of workshops, right, that go through the different pillars of the well-architected framework that we just mentioned. They're essentially helping you learn about these best practices and apply them in a hands-on way. We're going to be deploying this application, which is essentially a simple 3-tier application, right? So we have a database in a multi-AZ setup. Then we have an auto-scaling group with an instance in each availability zone. And then we also have an NAT gateway, right? That's pretty much what we're going to use to assess, right? For the purpose of keeping it simple, keeping the scope small, so that we look at what Resilience Hub has to offer. Cool. So then, without further ado, I guess we can jump right into it. This is the landing page that you're going to see the first time you go into Resilience Hub. So if you don't have any application, right, you have a quick navigation to the main dashboard, applications, policies, and notifications. So we're going to go through them step by step. But I guess the first thing to get started would be to just add an application, right? So the way we can add applications, Resilience Hub essentially discovers the resources in the applications and will create a reference, right? So essentially a record of what the application is, what it is composed of. And we can have up to 5 CloudFormation stacks, or we can essentially import an existing Resilience Hub application. We can use one from an app registry, right? So essentially, if you're offering if you're, for example, a platform team, maybe, right, and you're offering your internal customers, right, platforms pre-configured, predefined, right, you may want to kind of look at that template and to include it in Resilience Hub and to measure its resilience, right, to kind of keep a check on that. Or you can have resource groups. So luckily, the application that we're looking at today is CloudFormation based. So we're going to just choose the stacks, right? Essentially, the stacks that we are interested in are the web servers for resiliency testing, right? The MySQL layer, and then the VPC with the associated resources. There's also a way here to add stacks outside of AWS region. So we can essentially describe a multi-regional kind of application, right? However, if we want to add a stack outside of this AWS region, we need to provide the ARN, right? So
and you need to set up the permissions to be able to reach that stack. So
exactly, yeah. So once we selected the stacks, right, the next thing to do is essentially give a name and description to the application. So let's just call it web application office hours demo, right? And then we can add a description, so something like mission critical web application. Right. And this just helps us identify what the application is, especially if we have a lot of them. Of course, as a best practice, we also recommend tagging the resources and also the resilience hub assessments, right, in the applications. It does make sense, right, because you can essentially have an overview of what really is connected to one particular workload. So here I would say something maybe like cost center, right, and then I would just add a random cost center, and then I would add workload and just call it web app demo, right? So then once we hit next, we are going to have the resources identified, and this can take a while. So it's going to describe essentially these stacks and look at what's inside. Then we're going to see soon a list of the resources inside. So we found 8 resources, out of which 6 are included and supported. 2 of them are not supported yet, but of course these are essentially going to be supported at a later time, right? One thing that we need to remove from this particular one is this Lambda. The Lambda is actually not in scope of the infrastructure, so this is essentially just a custom resource that helps with orchestrating the deployment, right? So I would just exclude it here at this step out of the resilience VPC stack, right? Then it's just going to update these things, the resources, redescribe them, and then we should be good to go. Right, so now we can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that I'm sharing the link to the documentation in the chat. I believe that also explains what resources are supported and so on as of now. But as Florin said, more resource types will be included as more and more customers start using the service.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we're actually going to have a look at the resources soon. So let's just go through that, right? We will select the policy. So I already created a policy. If you don't have one here, right, for the first time, you can just click on Create Resilience Policy, and this will essentially take us to the policies view, right? And we can create a policy based on business needs. So we can essentially give it a name, description, and then kind of classify what application is it. Is it, foundational IT core services, something like email, without which, nobody could do any work? Is it mission critical? Is it non-critical? And then you can do also manual configurations, right? What is the RTO and what is the RPO? So maybe just to have this definition out of the way, right? Recovery time objective is essentially from an outage, right? From a moment of outage, how much time would it take to bring the application back to operation, to normal operation, right? So that's the time objective of recovery. And the recovery point objective is essentially how much data can we lose? So before an outage, right? How much data is acceptable to lose? So for some applications, this may be really 0 seconds, right? For some applications, be more of minutes or hours, or it really depends on the application itself. So
basically means if there is an outage and you have to revert to, for instance, a backup, it's a matter of how far how far backwards you are able to go and lose the data in between. That was a strange explanation of what you actually explained a lot better.
Exactly. So if you think of, the outage would be at one particular point backwards, right? How much data did we lose? That's the RPO, and then forwards, how much time does it take to get back to speed, would be the RTO. So again, you can define these manually. So we can look at application, right? Customer application. So these would be RTOs and RPOs related to things like software bugs or some operator error or a bad release or something like that, right? So this is essentially something that would cause some kind of business failure. So APIs to fail or something like that. Then we have the infrastructure itself, and the infrastructure, we look at individual components. We look at availability zone, and we also look at region. So in this session today, we're not going to take a look at the region because our application is bound to a single region. But of course, if we would have imported a multi-region application, we would have gotten recommendations in that way as well. Then there are tags in case you want to tag the policies. But what I did is I used a suggested policy. So, it's giving you an easier starting point, and then you can essentially look at some suggested policies. I classified this as mission critical application, right? And I just created this one, and then I had to perform an edit. So the edit that needed to be performed is here at application layer, because we're using an RDS database, right? And we're not using Aurora. So the actual failover and RTO is about 1 hour 40 minutes, give or take. So I just edited the RTO to be 1 hour and 40 minutes, right? Because of course, in the scope of the demo, I don't think we have time to really upgrade to Aurora right now. It would take a bit. Right. So you can use these as a starting point, right? And essentially adapt them to your business
So,
needs.
Florin, in your experience then as a solutions architect, do businesses have RTOs and RPOs in place for their applications and their infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say most of them do. I've seen some that don't. I would highly recommend that, right? Because I think it's important to really think of what are our goals, right? To really measure against. So it's hard to answer a question of, are we meeting resilience or availability targets if we don't actually set a target? Of course, the first time around, the target doesn't need to be hyper aggressive, unless again it's a critical system, right? But it's good to start measuring these things and kind of turning it into metrics. Like, for example, how many bad deployments have we had this month, right? Do we want to include that as a metric? Do we want to track that and try to improve that to essentially measure where we are and see whether we're making progress in the direction we want to go? So strongly recommend that they would be included. Even better if they're actually, if our customers think about them before they go live with an application, because just thinking about these things makes you really ask some really interesting questions like, should we use more availability zones? Should we back up our data the way that we back up our data? Can we recover within a specific time frame? Do we even need to, right? And I think this is not just something that the technology side can answer, right? So if we just throw it over the fence to the infrastructure teams, right, it's not something that can be answered there, because there are business components in there. You also need to kind of work with your stakeholders to understand what are their expectations as well.
Having that discussion between the different organizations within your company, I think that's an interesting discussion to have, because it needs to somehow be related to what you're actually building. To, as you mentioned, if you need to use multiple availability zones, if you're using RDS or if you're using Aurora and so on, to be able to meet these. But AWS Resilience Hub then will also, what we're going to see is that it's going to help us show if what the RTOs and RPOs we're setting up is actually feasible.
Sure. Yeah. So that's essentially the creation of policies, right? I will not create that one because I already have this one right here, right? So I will just go to it. Actually, that's why I couldn't see the policies. My session has expired, so let me just re-log in. Of course, the demo effect as always, right?
Oh, but that's it's there to show that it's a live demo.
Yeah.
So, all right, you're back up with your screen share again.
Yeah. So then we have so this is the web application policy that I created, right? I just mentioned that we changed the RTO to 1 hour and 40 minutes. And then if we go back to actually creating the application, right? We can see that it's not published. So what we created already is still saved, right? So we don't have a resilience policy attached because we didn't attach it, right? We stopped at that step. So we would essentially need to first attach a resilience policy, and then I would just select this one to attach. And then we see here we have a summary of the application. So we see, what version are we looking at? It's actually in draft because we haven't published the application yet. So we're always looking at 2 versions that we're working with. Right now we only have draft because we didn't really publish it, right? But we will always have a release version and a draft version to allow us to perform some changes, right? So one thing that needs to be done here, and this is something that we've reported to the service team and will be fixed soon. The NAT gateway is detected as 3 components because it is a highly available, right, managed service. So by default, it has 3 components, and if we assess them as such, right, they will be considered as one resource per availability zone, so they will not pass the check. So what we need to do here is we would just add this as a network. We would create a new component and just call it an add gateway. And here you can see the component types, right? So we're talking about resources and components, right? So first of all, what is a component? Components are essentially different groupings of resources that belong together, right? So here we have compute, database, networking, queuing, and storage app components, right? So we want to create one for the networking app component to essentially reassign these NAT gateways to one component so that they are belonging together, right? They are assessed together and not as part of 3 different components as they are right now. So the way I would do this, I would just select each one of them and I would say change component. I would remove the component that it got auto detected to, and I would just add this one that we just created. So I will add NAT gateway 1, and then do the same for the other ones before I actually publish the application. So again, this is giving you that kind of step to reevaluate the detection, right? How the resources were detected. If you want to kind of perform logical regroupings, exclude maybe some of them if you haven't excluded them in the first step, and make sure that everything is good to go. So I would also add this to the NAT gateway component, and then we have the third one.
And you talked about thinking about resilience, RTO, RPOs, even before you actually start building an application. But when you actually have it in place, that's when you start using AWS Resilience Hub. Is that the case? Since you're using a CloudFormation stack, for instance, you need to have infrastructure in place to be able to use it.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, right? I mean, at the same time, you can evaluate, I guess before going to production, right, you're going to test the application or deploy it in a staging environment or in a pre-production environment. That's maybe somewhere you can already start, using Resilience Hub and assessing the application before you get started with this. So if you have something that is similar to production, to the way it will look in production, you can already start before going productive. So some of these recommendations and a lot of the recommendations in well-architected framework are applicable early in the development stage, right? And again, resilience is something that has impact, in the way you develop the software, in the way you test it, and what you test, and so on. So thinking about it as early as possible will help you catch some of these maybe omissions or bugs right earlier in the process. Yeah. So here I've added all these to the aggregated component. So I will delete the generated ones. Right. I will just remove these that don't actually have anything inside, and then we can publish our application. So now we have the resources, we have the NAT gateways belonging to the same component, and I would just click here, publish new version, right? This pop-up tells me here that, of course, I need to be careful that the release one will always be the one that assessments will be run against, right? And as soon as I press publish, we see that we have a release version, and there's no difference right now, right? But I could start working on the draft and change the infrastructure as the application evolves, right? Because I guess maybe if you're not running resiliency assignments every day or every week, if you do it once a year or before business peaks, I guess maybe there are some changes to the application infrastructure or architecture. And then, of course, you can work on that draft and make sure that you assess the latest version. So with that in place, right, let me just get these green pop-ups away from here. We have these kind of 4 steps, which are the main workflow in Resilience Hub, right? So we published the application, we described it, and we looked at the resources. The next one is to assess the resilience, right? So running an assessment will result in us getting a report. So I will say here, report demo, let's just call it, 2021-11-22. And then we just run the report. So this will essentially look right in the Resilience Hub backend at all of the resources, the way they're set up, what kind of configurations do they have? Does the database have a kind of backup, continuous backup? Do we have an auto-scaling group? Do we have configurations in place? And come back with recommendations, right? 3 types of recommendations, namely, and these are alarms, standard operating procedures, and fault injection experiments. So alarms are essentially, things that we may want to be notified of, things we may want to continuously watch. Standard operating procedures, kind of operational runbooks, how to do a particular task in our infrastructure, and then fault injection experiments. We're going to see, things like taking down an availability zone whenever we want to, or refreshing instances in an auto-scaling group, failing over a database, things like that, right? So things that could happen right in a day-to-day business that you want to check. So with that said, right here, we have the list of assessments. Here we would keep all of the assessments, right, in case you have a need to show them maybe to external auditors or something like that, right? You can always revert back in time. Maybe a smart thing would be to, I don't know, include a kind of, if you have a global versioning system, right, to include what was the version of the application at that particular time, so that right, version X of my application with all of the dependencies ran through this assessment, and this was the result. So looking at the assessment report, right, we see that the policy is met. So we have here the results in terms of RTO and RPO, right, and they are split across application type, infrastructure type, availability zone, and the region is not applicable because we don't have a multi-region construct. So if we expand all of these, right, we can see what is the target RTO and what is the estimated RTO. And we can look at breaches, if there are any breaches, right? And here we can actually hover over and click on the estimated RTOs to see how did we reach these conclusions, right? So for the compute one, right, how much it takes to roll back or forward to a stable configuration. Of course, they're based on estimates, so the average real time may really vary. And then the more the more this gets used, then I guess the improvement, the recommendations would be better. Then the database app component, right? Again, we have an RDS, so we don't have Aurora here. This is the estimated RTO. The networking app component, right? We just mentioned it. It's NAT gateway, so it's fully managed. It's highly available, so we don't estimate that there's any RTO and RPO impact. And the same goes for cloud infrastructure and availability zone, right? So, and then here, all of them are documented, right? How did we get these suggestions? And in case there is a breach, which one is the breach? So luckily, we don't have that. But what we do have, and is very interesting maybe at the top, is resiliency recommendations and operational recommendations, right? So if we look at the first ones, right, just clicked on the resilience recommendations, we can see that we have the three components that we just created, the compute one, the database one, and the networking one, right? So they're essentially evaluated independently as part of a workload. And here we have three kinds of recommendations that we get. So first one would be optimizing for availability zone, RTO and RPO and compute. The second one would be optimizing for cost, and the third one would be optimizing for minimal changes. So you can see that there are different changes in terms of, you know, how much do we want to invest either as money, right, or as time spent there, or whatever the goal is, right? So here, the availability zone one is the most comprehensive, right? So we could add an auto-scaling group in a different region, right, and then do kind of rerouting to this different region using Route 53. And it also includes the one which is optimizing for cost, right, to have min size to 2 and max size to 4, so that we don't have one instance maybe in every availability zone because of the traffic that we have. And in terms of minimal changes, we don't actually have anything in the compute, but if you look right at each one of them, you will see different recommendations. So,
yeah, and these recommendations, they are then basically built on a rule set that relies on the well-architected framework and architectural best practices.
Yeah, and also, of course, on what we see, right, in terms of usages and in terms of what our customers are doing. We just saw that we have the estimates, right? How do we estimate these application RTOs? And of course, the changes themselves, right? They also come with updates to the estimates, right? So here we see that we would have some improvements in terms of RTO and RPO if we would do this change, right? And maybe in the compute one as well, right? We would have, again, infrastructure and application impacts across these two stacks. So that's kind of the resilience recommendations we have. What we could do now, right, is we could essentially go and take this change, right, and perform it, and then rerun the assessment, right? Because I guess between running assessments, you would do some of these changes. So every time you assess, right, we're looking at the infrastructure and the application as it stands. Additionally, we have operational recommendations, and these are the ones that we mentioned, right? So these recommendations are provided on a best practices, you know, as we see in AWS. But again, application resilience is really it varies from application to application, even within the same department, within the same customer, right? They may have two kind of applications they're responsible for, and of course they need to evaluate them independently. So in terms of operational recommendations, we have alarms. One of the very interesting ones, the ones that we would create, is the AWS Resilience Hub Synthetic Canary. So this is essentially a synthetic canary. It's an alarm that we get as a recommendation, right? It's common to everything, and with it we could create a synthetic test to our API, right? So that we essentially ping every minute our EC2 instance to see whether it's still up and running. And on that note, right, this is essentially what you will get with the infrastructure. So it's just going to serve the metadata of the instance, and you're going to see essentially the availability zone that is essentially serving this request, right? So this is the one that we would create. What would happen is we would click on Create CloudFormation template, right? And we would essentially create it in CloudFormation. I already have all of these created, so I will not create them right now in the interest of time, but I will show them to you, right? And this generates really a CloudFormation template. You can just take all of them, go to CloudFormation, and just create them, right? And there are more, right, that we don't have set up. Like, for example, high CPU utilization, ASG alarm, overutilized CPU for the RDS instance, and so on and so forth, right? So for all of them, we get all of these operational recommendations, right? Then we get standard operational procedures, and here, these are essentially how to scale up and scale down the ASG, and restoring RDS from a backup. And again, it's the same thing, right? If we would click it here and create a CloudFormation template, we would generate a generated template. And the templates that you create, right? So that's just for the sake of demo. I will create one here. I would call it Synthetic Canary, right? And just say web application. And then when we create it, right, it first of all will notify us here that it's being created, and it will also add this newly created template to the template side, right? So these are the ones that we chose to actually go forward with. And if we go ahead and click on this one, right, you will see that it created an S3 bucket where we have everything. We have everything inside. So essentially, you would go to this S3 bucket, and we would go to the alarm folder, and we have a JSON here, which is essentially the CloudFormation template, right? And this would contain the alarm. So we would download this, go to CloudFormation, and just drop this in. Yeah, so that's what we get out of the assessment report, right? Additional operational recommendations include fault injection experiments, and these are maybe the interesting ones, right? Because now we can look at a holistic view of, what is my resilience? What experiments can I run? When did I run them, right? What was the impact, and so on and so forth. To run the experiments, the actual execution of the experiments depends on some of these alarms, right? So we would need to essentially provide, for example, if we are looking at, let's say, refreshing instances in ASG or simulating an availability zone outage. When we run this experiment, right, the experiments come predefined, but they do require a synthetic canary alarm, right? And Resilience Hub makes it easy because we can just import this one, right, so that we have it already created, and everything is ready to go, right? So
it then uses that as a stop condition in the experiment.
Yeah, exactly. So this is essentially the thing that will be monitored, right? If something goes wrong with the alarm, then of course we will see it on the dashboard, and the experiment will go will stop, right? So we go back to the dashboard, right? We see that we have this application, and currently it has we didn't set up the recommendations, right? And we have a resilience score of 0%. So the way the resilience score is calculated, it's essentially a weighted normalized value between 0 and 1. And you can find this in the documentation. So we have the test coverage, the monitors coverage, and the standard operation procedure coverages. So all of these suggestions, out of them, how many did we implement? And there's also a weight associated to all of them, right? So if the recommendations are for a regional outage, maybe the weight is not so high, right? Because it's a more unlikely event, right? However, if we're looking at a software disruption type, because you roll out the bug, right, that would have a higher weight, because, of course, these things, so changes in the software layer are more frequent and more likely than a region not being available. Yeah, so this is the application. So what would happen now? I would set up the recommendations, and then I would essentially reassess the application, and the application would the Resilience Hub would detect that I have set up these recommendations, right, and we can run the experiments. So I will go to CloudFormation real quick so that we see that we have these set up. We have the stacks, right? So we have here in the lower side, we have the CloudFormation stacks for the other application that I prepared. And here I have the web application Canary Alarm, and then I have the 2 fault injection simulator experiments. So we have ASG instance replace and ASG and availability zone outage. So what does the Canary Alarm actually look like, right? It's going to create a CloudWatch alarm, and it is this one over here. So this is the name that the that we will need when we actually run the experiment. And as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it here the best, right? We have a success percentage of 100%. The alarm itself alarms on whether the success percent is lower than 100 for any 2 data points within 3 minutes, right? So we wouldn't accept any kind of outage for the experiments that we run because we do have a multi-availability zone set up. We do have an auto-scaling group, right? And we would expect the application to still be running, right? Albeit maybe not serving from some availability zones. So this is what you get with from Resilience Hub, right? You would need to essentially edit this metric and specify the name of the canary. So the canary itself is not defined because this is something specific to your application, right? So here, if you go back to CloudWatch, right, in application monitoring under synthetics canaries, you can create a new canary and essentially define, how to measure the application. So I have it already prepared, but how you can essentially measure that, right, is you can just add an application or endpoint URL, and you will get essentially a Puppeteer script that just tries to fetch the web page, right? And this is essentially the actual data underneath the alarm, right? So that's something we have. I called it simply Canary, right? And this is the name that I've also put in the alarm that comes from Resilience Hub, and you can see that it's essentially checking the health of the application all the time. So with that up and running, right, if we look at the other application, which is essentially the same one with the recommendations set up, right, I can see here that in terms of the summary, we have improved the resilience score because we have added some of these recommendations. One of them is the alarm. We have 2 of the experiments. So we have here also executions, right? These are actual executions. In Fault Injection Simulator, we differentiate between an experiment template, which is how to run an experiment, and an experiment execution. Yeah, and here we can go to FIS and see what happens, but we will just actually run our own experiment. Let's see. So we have here the simulate AZ availability zone outage or refreshing the instances in an availability zone. So I don't know, do you have any preference which one we should run?
AC is fun, I think.
Okay, so then let's try to start the experiment. Here we get notified, you're gonna do something that may be disruptive. So we just get a confirmation. I would start the experiment. So then we have here the experiment being initiated. I will open the EC2 console just so that we look at the instances. And in the meantime, we go to FIS to see the console, right? So Resilience Hub really set up everything in terms of, I got a CloudFormation template, and all of these templates were pre-created, right, to simulate an availability zone outage. You can take a look at them and edit them, right? But it essentially uses the SSM document integration. So this already has integration with the things like EC2 and RDS, right? But for anything that is general purpose and is not covered, you can run an SSM document. And that's essentially what is being done here. So here we can look at the targets, and we can look at the what kind of exports, right? The targets are not defined because everything is within the script. So we're going to take one availability zone down. And if we look here, the stop condition was already pre-set to this synthetic canary, right? So it's the one that we have created. There's an IAM role created, right? So that we make sure that we enforce principle of least privilege, right? We don't need to give the experiment more permissions that it needs to have. And then if we look at the timeline, right, it's just running this automation script. So system automation script. So we can go to Systems Manager, and we can look at automation. And we can essentially see this is the execution that is currently in progress from FIS, and we can see what is it actually doing, right? So currently it's selecting an execution mode. It's terminating some instance. So it was already pretty fast. Maybe we've already missed it. I think not. Looks if I'm refreshing, right? We're only getting B and C. Now A is back as well. So if we're refreshing this over here, we see that C was actually terminated. Right, so the instance is being terminated, and we can still see we just get A and B, so we don't get C anymore. I'm not sure if you can actually see this very well, so maybe, right, we're looking here at the availability zone.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, right, the canary is actually doing the same thing right behind the scenes, and it's just getting all this data and we can go back to our alarm and see that it's still fine because we still have two availability zones serving. So we're not in alarms. We're still green here, and everything is fine, right? Yeah. So now I guess as part of the experiment, right, we have terminated the web server, the instance, right, and the autoscaling group will pick up the change, and at some point we'll bring it up to speed. So that's kind of what it looks like. That's one experiment. That's a very quick introduction, right? And after running this experiment, right, if we reassess the score, right, this would also be taken into consideration in assessing the resiliency. So that's the continuous part and continuous resilience where you measure, right? You essentially define what does normal really look like, right? What is a normal steady state for my application, and then what would happen if I would do this or that, right? Or do I need to think about it? And then really turning them into kind of like school experiments, right? To really try to take down some of these instances, and then to measure, and see, is there any difference to your hypothesis? If there is, of course, update the hypothesis because it's always a living document, a living thing, right? And the same thing goes for policies and the application itself, right? So we can always go back to the application descriptions, right, under versions, and start working on the draft and see, look, we're not using this MySQL anymore, so we can exclude the resource, right, and we can include some new resource, like for example, I don't know, we can add a new resource and just say, here's, by the way, the list of the resources supported, right? So you see here API gateway, auto scaling groups, DynamoDB, and so on and so forth, right? We could say that maybe we add an S3 bucket, or we just add a DynamoDB and we don't want to include this MySQL database. So you can always kind of change that and update it. Yeah, so these are the experiment templates. If I go back to summary, we're seeing that the experiment itself is still running, so I guess it's gonna take a while. But again, if we look at the alarm, right, everything is still okay.
I think from just that perspective, with the experiments with chaos engineering, Resilience Hub really shows it more in context, what chaos engineering is about in a larger context. That it's not only about running an experiment to cause or inject failure. It's actually about this entire journey to make your system more resilient to failure, and to actually assess what those experiments do.
Sure. Yeah. So I think Adrian is actually one of the people I work with a lot, right? I think you've had him on the show as well. I like that he says that chaos engineering is more of a thinking thing than a doing thing, right? So it's more, kind of assessing, evaluating, determining what are the, whatever service level agreements or whatever we have, right, that we are committing to the business or to other stakeholders. And the actual experiments, are just a reflection of that. So it's not really about creating chaos, right? It's about kind of measuring and trying to tame that chaos inherent in these systems. So it doesn't go to say that, just go ahead and take down 3 availability zones, because if it doesn't give you any kind of insight about your application and you're just going to cause an outage, you're going to upset some people, right? Hopefully, the end consumers are really going to be upset, but also business stakeholders, and that's not really a good experiment, right? It's just it's obvious, right?
Yeah, I know Casey Rosenthal, one of the creators of chaos engineering at Netflix, he famously said that I wouldn't have a job very long if I were only breaking things on purpose all day. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Absolutely. So you've now walked us through AWS Resilience Hub from the beginning, creating an application, then creating or attaching a policy, doing the assessment, looking at the result of that, the report you get from that assessment, and finding the if you are in line with your RTOs and RPOs, or if you need to improve your application. Yeah. And how would you say that? How would you say that companies would use this? Is this something that would be used by the engineering teams themselves to create these reports, or is it something that would be done on a different level within the organization.
Sure.
It's a brand new service, so this
Yeah.
is just hypothesis right now.
Yeah, of course. So I would imagine, honestly, that both could do that, right? So depending on the kind of setup that that our customers have, you could imagine engineering teams that we also have at Amazon, right? That kind of have a you build it, you kind of own it approach to things. So in that aspect, right? Of course, the things that they build, they're responsible to assess and to monitor and measure. However, there are sometimes platform teams, infrastructure teams, so maybe teams that are responsible for kind of the data platform or the message streaming infrastructure, right, that provide it as a service to other teams. So I guess for the core components that they would use, they would be responsible to assess, and the engineers using them would rely on them, right? But of course, having this measurement and having this thought up front, right, would help everyone to communicate better and align on the goals, right? Because if you provide something as a platform, if you think about it, and your consumers can look and see that your SLAs are maybe not matching with what they expect, they can make better, more informed decisions than if it's just an anecdotal kind of evidence. So I could imagine both. I hope both, right? I guess it's never too early or too late to start talking about resilience. So definitely hope that this is useful to more and more of our customers, and especially as we add more services and more recommendations. And
and having it as a basis for that discussion over across team boundaries, for instance, to be able to talk about what are the improvements we need to do. And because often the improvements we see, well, sometimes they have a cost associated with them, of course. To be able to run services in a certain way might increase the cost, but instead you might then have a better chance of reaching that RTO or RPO goal.
Sure, absolutely. And I like that you also see in Resilience Hub these kind of pragmatic advices, taking into consideration, are you really going for that extreme resilience use case? Is it really a payment system or something like that, or a healthcare system, whatever? Or are you more looking for cost or for minimal change, right? Do you have a deadline that is really tight and you're still trying to do something, but you also want to fit it in a backlog, right? So it's nice that you get all of these suggestions and you can pick and choose them or add them all to your backlog, but you already have some sort of priority predefined, right? And you're still able to change that. Yeah. So cool. I see your experiment is still running. So what would happen after the experiment would be that we would just click here on reassess, right? And we would get another evaluation, and then we could look at the recommendations, right? And then our score would also be recalculated, but I'm not sure if that's something we're going to be able to do now.
No, while it's still running, I suppose we can't do that, but we're trusting you on that one, Florin.
Yeah.
Cool. So I've shared a bunch of links in the chat throughout the session, so take a look at those. Is there anyone I haven't shared? I haven't shared the API reference. I'll share that one as well. To have that. Any final things you want to add on about AWS Resilience Hub, Florin?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, as a call to action, take a look at the service, try to play with it, read the documentation, see what it offers, right? And it's free from the moment you start using it for 3 months. So you can add some applications and really test them in a safe environment, right? See if it makes sense to you and your teams. And if you would like to see new features, or you would think some things can be done better, definitely reach out to your AWS point of contact, and we're happy to hear feedback and to kind of take this in the right direction.
Sure. And if you are interested in AWS Resilience Hub and you haven't checked that out yet, well, have a look at AWS Fault Injection Simulator as well. As you saw, it was tightly integrated Resilience Hub and AWS FIS, so do check out both of those services. So we are approaching top of the hour. I want to thank you, Florin, for joining us today. And thanks to all the viewers for joining us as well. And I we've having a look at how AWS Resilience Hub is able to help us in preparing and protecting our applications from disruptions. So I'm very interested to see how AWS Resilience Hub is used by our customers going forward. So hopefully, Florin, I'll have you on again in some time when we have more things to talk about in the resilience and chaos engineering space.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. It was really a pleasure to give the demo and to have this resilience chat again. It's always a good time to talk about resilience, especially continuous resilience. So looking forward to that.
And if people want to reach you, Florin, you are available on LinkedIn, I believe. So people can connect with you there. And and if you want to connect with me, you can see my Twitter handle on screen. I'm also on LinkedIn, of course. And with that, thank you all for watching. Thanks, Florin, once again. And I just want to make a last-minute recommendation that next week is the big show of the year, AWS reInvent. So if you're not in Vegas for reInvent, well, do sign up for reInvent virtually and join us and watch the keynotes, the leadership sessions, and a bunch of sessions that will be available on demand as well. All right. Thank you all, and have a good day ahead.